Members of the European Parliament are set to discuss issues surrounding the future of the European Union. They include the United Kingdom's possible exit from the EU and rezoning and suspending or even dissolving the Schengen zone. Member states will also propose their conditions for EU reforms. There are fears that the Union may break up, with European Parliament Martin Schulz and UK Prime Minister David Cameron holding talks early this morning. Well, let's get more on what's happening in Brussels today. We're joined by Kevin Osbeck. Many thanks for joining us. Kevin, some stark comments from EU Chief Donald Tusk yesterday, warning that the EU was at a critical moment in its history and that the risk of breakup is real. How much on the agenda is this issue going to be in Brussels today?
Well, it's at the very top of the agenda today, and it'll be at the very top of the agenda all week long, because on Thursday and Friday we have this big EU summit. And at the summit, Prime Minister David Cameron hopes he can strike a deal with all of his colleagues and all of the fellow heads of state from the European Union countries. Well, here in Brussels this morning, you mentioned that Prime Minister David Cameron met with the President of the European Parliament. He also met with several members of the European Parliament. This is so if he does strike this deal later this week, he can have some sort of a guarantee from the European Parliament that in the months to come, in the months down the road, they won't try to break up this reform package through Parliament legislation. And then later this morning, David Cameron will be meeting with the President of the European Commission. You also mentioned Donald Tusk, President of the European Council. He is in Eastern Europe right now, meeting with leaders there to make sure he can get them on board with the reform package, because Donald Tusk, at the very top of his mind, at the very top of his personal agenda, is keeping the European Union together.
And how worried do you think EU members are that if Britain leaves, it could be the start of some sort of domino process?
Well, of course, there is the possibility that this could set a precedent. And of course, in almost every single European Union country, there are political parties that are very anti-EU. So they could, if in fact the Brexit goes through, be inspired to then create their own movement to leave the European Union. When it comes to the different countries, they have different issues with Prime Minister Cameron's reform package. David Cameron was in France last night, meeting with Francois Hollande. France in particular takes issue with the UK wanting more say in the EU monetary policy, even though it doesn't use the euro currency. We've also talked about Eastern Europe, and that's where Donald Tusk is right now. Many of those countries take issue with the UK wanting to cut welfare benefits for EU migrants, because that greatly impacts many Eastern Europeans who've left the East and headed west towards the UK in hopes for a better future. So a very complicated issue, many different facets to this, but EU leaders are really hoping that by the end of this week at this EU summit, a deal can be struck, so it's at least done on their end, and then everything will be in the hands of the UK voters, who will eventually decide all of this in a referendum.
Indeed. Okay, Kevin, good to speak to you. Kevin Osbeck joining us live there from Brussels.